Hi. Really good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio Lunchtime Talk. These talks are live every Friday at 1 p.m, both here in the building and live online across Twitter, Facebook and YouTube. So whether you are in Bristol or far away, you can join the conversation. I am Vanessa Bellesprout. I'm a person with a blonde ponytail, shoulder-length hair and glasses, and I talk with a slight Dutch accent. Grace will be joining us remotely. And just a little bit about the Lunchtime Talks in the studio. So these Lunchtime Talks are part of our Open Studio Friday offer. So every Friday we throw open the doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and offer you the chance to spend time in the space by hot desking alongside our residents and staff from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. And the talks cover loads of different topics, from innovative research in fields of creativity, technology, to projects in progress, which are in need of feedback, questions and curious minds. So an especially big welcome to all of you, to those who are new in the studio as well, and for who it may be the first time you're engaging with us. So those of you who've heard this bit before, which is a little bit long, you can take a moment to share the link to the talk on your socials or quickly grab a cup of tea and get even more people to join us. So what is the Pervasive Media Studio? So we are a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art and loads more. So it's a partnership between the University of the West of England, University of Bristol and Watershed. Of course, you're in Watershed's building. We are a home for embryonic ideas, research and development, and the building of new companies. We're also a meeting place of both creative and commercial industries. So we offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events, opportunities to our residents, and as part of our we've kind of got a spirit of generosity and mutual exchange, so people don't pay to have a desk with us. So we're a space for people to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. A quick bit of housekeeping, particularly for those of you who are in the building right now. So obviously feel free to move around, make a cup of tea, or grab a glass of water. We have in the kitchen over there. We have a quiet space just here on my left, your right. That's for anyone who needs to have a break at any point. We have fire exits at either end of the studio, and one of the studio team will direct you to them should we need to use them. Most likely not. We have accessible toilets and baby changing facilities just through the corridor there next to the kitchen. A captioned and recorded version of the talk will also be available here after the talk is finished. And if you're watching online right now and you'd like subtitles, just head over to the Facebook page for the live stream. You can just search for the Pervasive Media Studio. There's a Q&A at the end of the talk. And for those of you watching online, just pop your questions in the YouTube chat or tweet us at PM Studio UK. And if you're in the building, just raise your hand. You can get news on all our future talks by heading to watershed.co.uk/studio, at PM Studio UK on Twitter, Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram. Now, after all that, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. It's a real zeitgeist topic, which I'm sure will resonate with most of us. So this lunchtime talk, therapist, writer, researcher, and studio resident Grace Quantock explores her research with Clwstwr Creu, which translates to creative cluster in English, on news delivery and trauma. And I just want to say that there is mentions of the notions of particular trauma, but no visual or narrative depictions of such trauma. So welcome, Grace, and over to you.
And a pink top and a patterned orange and green dress. I'm sitting in front of some rainbowy paintings and books arranged by rainbow colour. And I'm really excited that we're going to be talking today about titrating how we take in news, about bearing the unbearable, and how we build future news delivery in a trauma-informed way. Because as the pandemic continues, climate crisis worsens, and governments fail citizens, our relationship with the news changes. And in my research, I explore with Clwstwr Creu on news delivery and trauma, thinking about searching behaviour, about how we take in updates and what we're looking for when we're seeking those. I think about when we search for news, what we are really needing to find, and encouraging us to think about how we want to create a world where more people can engage in citizenship and activism and the information that they need to be able to take those actions without re-traumatization. So, as we've said, this work draws on my research from 2020-2022 and my research previously as a Southwest Creative Technology Network data fellow, which I was very delighted to do at Watershed. And I really am with the, if we want to, so kind of the takeaway is we want to ethically engage our audiences, whether we're writing a hard news piece or whether we're making something that is an update on something that we're really passionate about. And we want to create conditions where we can make social and political change. Then we have to take trauma into account. So I spent 2020 researching the impact of trauma in news delivery and consumption, and looking at how what we can't see shapes our designs and our users' experiences. And I researched approaches to news delivery, including constructive news, positive news, the modular news delivery that Shirish Kulkarni, who's a fellow Clwstwr researcher, has been working so brilliantly on. And I interviewed experts like journalists and developers and academics, and those who are leading how we, re-envisaging how we approach journalism. And I also spoke to therapists who are thinking how we can support our clients to safely engage with news. In 2020, I was planning, before the pandemic, to do research with user groups, but I made a conscious choice to not do research with at a vulnerable time with marginalised groups. I didn't want to add to the trauma load of that time. So I delayed that stage, and I'm undertaking user-centred design and user research now, working further. But this R&D grew from my own work with clients. So I work with people as a therapist, as a counsellor with trauma and minoritized and marginalised identities. And I noticed that many people were finding ways of removing content from the web that they found difficult or traumatizing by things like blocking keywords, curating a follow list, using web extensions to control or limit certain websites. And a lot of technology was being used to avoid potentially triggering or activating material, and in doing so to access needed material. I started to think about what would happen if this type of delivery preference were built into the news platform and design, not something that we have to cobble together from a handful of apps, extensions and web blocking programs, etc. What happens if the responsibility is held by the deliverer and not by the user? And I had found that many people were polarising in their engagement with the news, so this may be relevant to some people today, particularly how the news stands now. Either switching off and not engaging, just saying I can't bear, or becoming very caught up in the news cycle and unable to look away. But what I noticed is that both of these states seem to contribute to the risk of being misinformed or more vulnerable to misinformation or disinformation, because the capacity to discern news and sources as trustworthy seem to become diminished by anxiety and lack of safety. As anxiety and lack of safety increased, that capacity to be able to discern really accurately seemed to get impacted. And then also people who were frustrated with mainstream news delivery seem to often seek alternatives to outlets that aren't meeting their needs and could get caught in unsafe spaces. And we know that conspiracy groups like QAnon, alt-right groups, have recruited really heavily during the pandemic. And many people can describe having lost somebody. It feels like a grief, losing somebody into a web of conspiracies. And so I started thinking about what protocols could support journalists and media outlets to frame the delivery of their outputs, to mediate an individual's processing, to figure out how trauma and well-being awareness could sit alongside our user engagement. Because we're often seeking engagement in our design. We want people to use what we make. But this requires, the engagement requires consent and the capacity, the space to be able to attend to something, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. And in creating trauma-informed design, we are, I believe, taking responsibility for our part in creating space for change, for people to be able to be included in our work and our communities going forward. So when I'm using the word trauma, we're talking about trauma in news, I'm referring to psychological trauma. Now, this can come from situations, events, or experiences we find traumatic. So this can be the events themselves, or it can also be how we are affected by the events or experiences. And traumatic events and experiences can happen at any age, and they can cause long-lasting harm and difficulty. Everybody has a different reaction. Some people might notice effects very quickly, some people not for a long time. Now, I'm going to talk very briefly about statistics. There's going to be a mention of types of abuse, but no graphic details. I'm going to go like this when I start, and I'm going to make it say stop when I stop. I'm hoping that's going to help, but you might want to mute or look away during this time. So to begin, starting. 1 in 5 adults 18 to 74 experienced at least one form of child abuse, whether that was emotional, physical, sexual abuse, witnessing domestic violence or abuse before they were 16. So that is 8.5 million people. That's according to the Crime Survey for England and Wales, not my favourite source, but it does show us some of the numbers. So I'm finished with talking about the types of trauma there. So carrying on. Trauma is present, we know this, and pain in the news is present. And we need to think about titration and about distressing news and how we can use titration to navigate this. So titration is actually a chemical term, but when we use it in a therapeutic sense, we're talking about getting in contact with small amounts of distressing or trauma-related material, and doing this very carefully so we can increase our window of tolerance to bear what is distressing and avoid getting thrown into overwhelm. So therapeutically, when we do this, we stay really close to and attend really closely to the sensations that we experience during the process so that we can develop our capacity to engage safely with what may be distressing material. And this is really coming from the basis that we'd rather not have these harms happen. And would rather these things not be happening in the world, in the news. But they are. And so as long as they are, how do we handle it? And how do we handle it so that we hopefully have the capacity and the possibility to help build and create and make together a safer world and the kind of world that we want to live in? And although we may not often think about trauma in design, when we're designing for a specific community, the experience and that characteristics of that community are often taken into account. And it's not uncommon for organisations to draw up, hugely detailed profiles of future users. But if we aren't taking into account their trauma load, then what we offer, what we are making, may contribute to overwhelm and even re-traumatization, people who may be exhausted by decades of suffering and oppression. So as somebody undertaking research in trauma-informed digital delivery, I was looking at this, and it's really framed around the idea that people who are checking the news are seeking something. So I frame this in the Gestalt term as a creative adjustment, an attempt to get a need met. Now, sometimes people pathologize this and say it's a maladaptive coping strategy. That is to say, we go to the wrong place to get the thing that isn't going to be there. But we want it to be there for whatever reason, and so we keep going. So I see this as we're trying to get something. So for example, we might call a relative that we know is dismissive and critical of us, but we want our loved one to be proud of us. So we call them for support and reassurance, even though experience tells us that we aren't gonna get that need met there. But we still keep going to try and get it met. And as a therapist, this seeking instinct is something that I cherish because it keeps us alive and it keeps us trying to get our needs met. However, the same drive can also make us vulnerable and get us tangled up in really painful dynamics, for example, with a family, or in algorithms and news updates that are really starting to actually harm us. So all this research came together in my traumatological framework. I created a wireframe where these psychological processes are used to bring filtration, titration, digestion, and containment to a user's contact with news delivery. We're not blocking news. We're looking to understand what people are seeking, getting clear on that, and thinking how we can deliver this more effectively. Now, there is challenge to this. There is challenge to whether this is the process we should be doing. Shirish Kulkarni, the fellow Clwstwr researcher and journalist, has pointed out that news holds people accountable for the choices that the government has made, that perhaps they have made, that perhaps they voted in a government that's doing this. Perhaps they made choices that contributes to this, and that we can't look away from what's happening from the results of the actions and choices we did or didn't take. Now, my theory is that many people are already looking away and disconnecting and denying entirely. And being able to engage may help people have some agency, to be able to make change and to be able to stay safe. So in addition to the wireframe, I've codified my research into some beta protocols for trauma-informed news delivery, which underpins my R&D. So I want to just talk to you about a couple of these today. So the first one is seeing what's being sought and thinking about understanding searching behaviour. So in my work speaking to journalists and academics, I noticed patterns around searching behaviour was being described in individuals accessing news. And people are often, I think, engaging in a searching behaviour to try and meet a deeper need. So just thinking through a few of these. These are things like, it might be pragmatic. You might be looking for factual information or updates, or witnessing. So you might be looking for personal narratives to reflect and validate your own experience. You might be looking for something to mirror you, that you've suffered something or that you're going through something and you want to feel not alone. And perhaps you can't find that around you in your communities for whatever reason. So, you really want to see this. There's a real craving to both witness and to be witnessed. So you go on the news and you read a story and it has somebody like you in it, or it has somebody suffering, or it has somebody who is suffering that you want to read it, and you may be looking for mirroring, or you may be looking to really bear witness to what somebody else is experiencing. And that is the urge to testify. So you may be wanting your story to be heard, but you don't have safe space for that. So maybe you look for news stories that reflect that, and then you share them on social media. So maybe you can't get close to your grief, but you can share a story that speaks to something of your experience. And maybe that does something for you. That's maybe enough for today. And so that's really important. Maybe you're looking to self-soothe by engaging a familiar activity. Maybe you're doing a check, like, is it got worse since I last looked? Or what I used to say, which is, I just need to check, is the world on fire in the same way it was when I went to bed? Just check. And these are attempts to soothe sometimes the existential crisis of living in such uncertain times. Now, there's various ones, these are just a couple of them, but lots of these are attempts at regulation. So let's understand that a little bit more. So in this therapeutic approach, it suggests that we're always in a dance almost of activation and regulation. So we're going to try a gentle exercise now to think about activation and regulation. You don't have to do it. Again, I'm going to say start, I'm going to do my little gesture, and then I'm going to do this the same at the end. If you don't want to do the exercise, now is just the time to mute. But it's just going to be a little exercise where we're going to think about some ideas, we're going to notice some sensation in our body, and then we're going to come back and reflect on it. Okay, so if you want to try it, At any point, if you want to come out, you can just say stop. You might want to clap your hands or touch an object if you can feel that object, and look around the room, orient yourself to the now, come out of that internal space and just remind yourself that you're back, and you can do that anytime. You don't have to wait for me to finish. So we're going to have a start. So we're going to start. And what I'd like you to do is just think about the last time you felt excited or anxious. Very similar feelings. And just think about that. So I'm going to think about it. It is about 30 seconds before I started this talk. And I can think about how that felt in my body, felt a little tight-chested. I can remember how it felt. And as I remember it, I feel myself starting to go back there again. My mouth's getting drier. I feel perspiration. My breath getting a bit shorter. I say, okay, so that's my activation is increasing. Okay, so now I'm going to regulate. So to regulate, I'm just going to look around my room. I'm going to notice what around my room looks soothing to me. Okay, so I can see some Polaroid pictures that I took in a little wood near our house. So you might be able to see, if you can see, my shoulders are dropping. I'm feeling more soothed. My breath is a little softer. So I just notice my body kind of melt down a little bit. Everything just gets a little easier, a little more flowing. So I'm regulating. And that's just a small example. So if you've done this with me, you may want to allow yourself to come back to the screen, see if you can re-engage, come back. Okay, so now we're done. Carrying on. So this is just an example of an activation and a regulation. And as we seek news, we're often seeking some form of regulation, but unfortunately what we're often receiving is more activation. And so then we're asking, is the news giving us what we need, and how can we get it? And this is about then building in agency. So this is the paradoxical theory of change. It's the idea that if we give people the option and the support to leave and to stop, that they may actually feel safer, and they may actually choose to engage more fully and be present with something. Now, you actually have to do it. You have to really be okay with people going. It doesn't really work halfway. It's not like if you say, I'm going to stop wanting the thing that I wish for. Is it here yet? You have to really commit to honouring people's ability, people's choice to leave. And that's about consent, and it's about agency, and it's about power. And often we can feel the news funnels us, that we lack agency as a reader. And it's about the agency. Do I have the agency to choose to go forward, or am I being taken on a journey through this? Now, sometimes looking at the news can be quite regulating and containing. Perhaps it's an episode, a programme, there's something that's contained. It can feel quite good to think, well, we can contain all the existential angst in like 20 minutes. That would be awesome if we could all do that. But it can also be very scary. Because we don't know what's going to happen when we check the news. We don't know what the news is going to be. There's that uncertainty. And then we're moving through perhaps how the website's been designed for us, or how the news feed has been designed, or how the television programme, how we access our news. And we don't know how that's going to go. But more than that, it's about power, because we're being delivered to often as a consumer. And so Desiree Adaway, who's a brilliant theorist and activist on inclusion based in the US, she talks about inclusion being a little bit like, well, if you think about a party, so if diversity is checking, have we asked everybody to the party? Right. Le bar. And then inclusion would be the people that come to the party, do they get to pick what music is? And do they get to choose the food and bring food? Or do they get to invite other people to the party? And then if we went to social justice, we start to say, well, why are we having this party here? Just because it's where we are. Should we be having this party in the day in Ramadan? That seems not like a good idea. Should we why are we having tables? Perhaps some people would like to sit on the floor. Perhaps some people would like to lie down. Perhaps some people don't want to be served food. Perhaps they want to be part of making the food, and that's part of the party. I'm really asking these questions. So in the news and the trauma-informed way, I think it's about who gets to know what's happening, who gets to know where the doors are, where the exit and entry points are, and who gets to control these. And so we think, because quite often we consume news, we don't get activated as an activist at the end of it. It's not, here's an update, here's what you go and do about it. It's much more consumable, and it's much more a download rather than something which we have agency in. And a lot of it is very hard to bear. So now I want to talk very briefly about the titration of trauma. And this is really, we're talking about how to bear the unbearable. And the idea of filtering or navigating our journey through news isn't to avoid experiencing painful things. We're not trying to take them away entirely or conduct any kind of exposure therapy. Instead, it's based on the neuroscience work of Peter Levine and Marion Dunley, and building on the idea that working with trauma is about moving through these waves of activation and regulation, like we may have felt a little bit earlier if we did. And we wanted to help people be conscious about what they're doing, to have enough resource to self-soothe, and to be able to bear looking at what is painful for long enough to be able to figure out what you want to do about it or what your response is going to be, without becoming activated or overwhelmed. It's based on attachment theory, the idea about developing a stronger attachment with oneself, something that's often broken in trauma. And then this titration and regulation can allow for a more balanced response in which we're aware of what's too much and we know what we do when we get there. So we're encouraging the user to think about how vulnerable they're feeling that day, how much things are just regulating them that day, and titrating the news to navigate that. Because the way we deal with news now, it's a lot. In this research, I asked my grandmother how before this research actually, in a very proto-early version, I asked my grandmother, how did you cope in World War II with so much death and loss and unbearable tragedy? And she said it was very difficult, but she said, you know what? Somehow the news taking weeks to arrive from the front line made absorbing it easier, because the slower pace gave time between the traumas to feel and to grieve and to process before being inundated with another event. And, I really acknowledge, I'm not saying it was good then. There wasn't a lot of agency around access to news. Often news was blacked out for morale reasons or suppressed. But what she said was, when they got the news of the deaths, the people who had been killed in the war would already generally been dead weeks. And so she said there was nothing we could do. It had already happened. But now we see it as it's happening. And I think that is such a point, that now we witness multiple tragedies in quick succession in real time. And modern news and social media, I believe, can give us a feeling of omniscience, because we see everything. We have a deity-like view from multiple angles and spaces in time. We've got the reports from the ground. We've got live stream from people who are there live streaming to their social media, or the videos get picked up by the news. We've got analysts talking about it. We've got people giving us the history of it. We've got understanding and links into previous news stories about it. And so we have huge amounts of information, this almost kind of deity-like view over it, but omniscient maybe, but not omnipotent. We don't have the power. And so we're watching the tragedy, seeing much, but generally influencing very little. And of course, I really want to acknowledge that what we're seeing is framed by the eye of the person reporting, even if it's not an eye of an opinion piece. So we don't even have the agency to write about it necessarily, or say our own ways of doing it. So we're getting information without agency, and that can be very painful. So Peter Levine's neuroscience research into trauma strongly emphasizes the importance of agency in traumatic situations. Feeling like we have agency can make a huge difference to mental health outcomes. But often the news doesn't offer us agency. It treats us like an audience rather than like engaged citizens. And that's a problem. And it's a problem because when we finish reading the news or consuming the news, we can just get stuck. So it's not just about how people seek and consume news, but how they move in and out of it. The process of moving onwards, that liminal space between news consumption and noticing when we've had enough, whether we've got what we needed to know, how we move onwards and process what we've read or heard or seen, that can be really tricky to navigate. And so, that in the research I'm doing, I'm building on a check-in process for how we can check in and notice when we're getting enough, what's happening for us. Part of that is seeing the states of trauma, which I've spoken about elsewhere here, which are fight, flight, freeze, flop, and friend. But noticing how are they showing up in our engagement, in our readers' engagement. Recognizing if we're getting stuck somewhere or we're leaving people to be stuck somewhere. Are we creating spaces where that's happening, and how can we address that? Because lots of news is designed explicitly to create an emotional response. For example, a lot of headline and story choices are really designed to invoke anger or outrage. And in news engagement, we may see these emotional states slip into the overactivation, the triggering of trauma. For example, flight might show up in news engagement as attrition, people dropping away at a certain point, or if someone's in freeze, they might be scrolling without engagement, they're just kind of checked out and doom scrolling. And I don't believe that this research is the end solution. But it's my plan, my hope is to try and limit the harm that's being caused while we build new ways of reporting, understanding, and sharing about our world. And as journalists and technologists and developers and researchers, we are culture makers. And we can perpetuate, or we can creatively challenge how trauma and pain is treated in our design and in our delivery. And our current news system is broken. How are we going to manage the harm it causes while we rebuild something fit for purpose for future generations? This is the question that I hope my work is being part of contributing to. And I look forward to us building a trauma-informed world through better trauma-informed media and technologies. And I thank you for being here and being a part of that with me today. And if you want to know more of my work, you can join me at gracequantock.com, at grace_Quantock. And if you follow me on Twitter, I'll also have a link to download my 3 principles for trauma-informed digital delivery for creative technologists. But thank you so much.
Wow, I'm definitely triggered from my thoughts. I particularly just wanted to say that I really love the BSL for doom scrolling, because I absolutely love doom scrolling. We're just going to open up for questions, but I was wondering if I could ask you one question first, Grace, before I open it up to the room, so you can ponder a little bit about what you might want to ask. And there's always a bit of a delay online as well. It just really struck me, this notion of, kind of not surprising notion of news as a commercial product. Sort of, we're in the sort of peak capitalism and we are suffering the consequences from that. And that purposeful triggering is part of the kind of commercial venture, creating revenue on the basis of kind of people's responses. And how can designers or developers make sure that their work is really and truly trauma-informed? Grace.
Great question, thank you. Absolutely. And one of the reasons that I'm actually it's kind of a very sad reason. One of the reasons I'm actually hopeful that there may be some engagement in this within the wider system is because I think so many people are shutting off entirely from the news because A, it's just very painful, but B, that kind of trigger button of our activation has been pushed so many times to make us read it and make us click, that for many people I think that there's just a level of shutdown. And so my wondering is, because of that, is there actually now going to be some appetite to kind of consider, oh, okay, we've really kind of blown that out. That's just not working anymore. We've just burnt out that way of getting people to click. Should we actually now go back to the drawing board and really think how we're going to sustain users? I'm speaking in that from the largest sense. I'm not imagining anybody here, of course, is going for that. But for the people, who are really wanting to make sure the work is trauma informed, I think understanding that and understanding the states of trauma, I do teach trauma informed tech workshops where we can think about what that would look like and how it would show up, but really becoming more trauma aware and having an understanding and building an understanding of trauma into the user testing and engagement, I think is going to be a really, really important part.
Thank you. And there's a really brilliant question online, Jade, if you want to read it out.
So it's from Tom Marshman, and they ask, do you think that there are two types of people, those that cry for the world and those that cry for themselves?
What an existential question. So I think I'd probably have to reflect more on that. But I guess I don't know if I'd say there were two types of people. I guess I'd say that there are thousands of types and they all sit on different intersections at different times. So there might be times when people are crying for themselves, and it might truly be for themselves and their pain. And then they might be crying for their pain within a greater pain that they are also very much aware of and aware of how little theirs is, and yet it's still hurting their heart. And so, obviously, I'm disabled and I'm with chronic illness, and I've spoken to people who kind of said, when they were very seriously ill or going through something very, 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 very upsetting, they really thought that they wouldn't be so upset about the little things anymore. But actually they were. They still had a row about the washing up when they had end-stage cancer. Or people who had, experienced incredibly traumatic difficulties, like, for example, fleeing a war, and would have thought that would be the thing I'd be upset about. But there's also that very human element of like, but I met him in the camp and he said he was going to speak to me, and now we're not in touch, and I don't know if he or they are safe, or if they just don't want to talk to me. And so I think that crying for oneself and crying for the world can nest in on each other and can sit along different sections, and you could move in and out of those at any different time on any given day or hour. So I hope that answers a little bit.
Are there any questions in the room?
It's kind of half-formed, but I was thinking about like the parallels of what you're talking about and how it kind of relates to climate change and how the kind of overwhelm of like apocalyptic climate news really informs many people to be quite apathetic. And I wondered if you had any kind of reflections on that and how that kind of translates or like lives on top of the work that you're doing.
Great question, thank you. Yeah, and I think exactly that level of overwhelm, which can cause a level of collapse and a level of hopelessness, and then disengagement, is absolutely part of why I'm doing this work, because I'm concerned that we aren't getting what the information that we need in a way that we can actually digest and use it actively, and that actually we're kind of getting fed more and more things that are disempowering us rather than empowering us. I think it's really tricky because there's, we often don't have a great window of tolerance for this. I mean, who has a window of tolerance for their own annihilation? I'm not sure it would be terribly healthy even to have a good window of tolerance for one's own annihilation. But I think collectively, we haven't being good at sitting with very, very difficult things. And I think often I see people actually going really strongly into hope instead. So there's collapse or there's kind of hope. Now I really acknowledge my work on this is really impacted by one of my therapeutic supervisors, Nick Totten, who's an eco-psychotherapist. So he actually is kind of thinks that sometimes, if I'm probably misrepresenting his views now, apologies, Nick, that sometimes we can go into hope as a way to avoid the pain of how things are now and how they likely will be and how urgent that action is. And so there's something about the window of tolerance of how we stay with what is without escaping into hope and these dreams of how it can be perfectly fixed, but also without collapsing into a complete hopelessness and that nothing will change. And it's that holding the tension of the opposites between those two, how we can get enough of what we need, enough hope, enough info, enough reality to be able to take the action we need to take. So I think that's where I am with that, but it really is one of the drivers of this work for me. So thank you for raising it.
Yes.
Hi, Grace. Brilliant talk. I was really struck by something you said. You said something about bearing the unbearable, which we see a lot, but we influence very little. And I wondered if having a clearer call to action, or at least understanding where we could make change, would help that threshold of bearing the unbearable. Do you think that's something that would sway how we process this information?
Yeah, absolutely. I think having that action and that agency will really help us, because it's not then that we just have to sit with the unchanging pain of something, but we actually have, okay, well, here's the thing that I can do towards that. And sometimes there is, I think, something of sitting with, I don't want to encourage people to jump into kind of fixing, or like the rescuer on the drama triangle. So there's something called the drama triangle, which you may have come across, and I don't like the words on it, but I'm using the traditional words because I think it's easiest to explain that way, and then we put our own ones on it. So we have the victim, the perpetrator, and the rescuer. And sometimes if we feel disempowered or in like a victim space, we might try and get out. So we may try to suddenly get ourselves into the rescue or the fixer position so that we can be somebody that fixes. But there's not really a solution to the drama triangle apart from stepping off it, because sometimes as we whoosh ourselves into the fixer, we actually then become a perpetrator of harm to somebody else, because we're so busy trying not to feel disempowered that we actually do go too quickly into doing something without enough listening, and then we actually end up hurting. So then someone maybe calls us out, and then perhaps we feel bad about that, so then we feel like we're back to the victim, and we say that they're being a perpetrator, and you just whiz around this drama triangle. So the kind of solution to that in some ways is to notice it and step out of it. So I'm not wanting to suggest that we all kind of magically become rescuers, because there is something that is unbearable that is true about that. But I absolutely think, imagine if at the end of the news story it could say like, this is an action you could take, or this is a petition, or this is the thing you could do. And they do occasionally have that, like, I don't know, the animal sanctuary blew away in the storm, like, you can donate to the animal sanctuary. But I'm always really interested in the ones that do have that and the ones that don't have that. But yeah, I do absolutely think that potentially having some call to action could really, really help us have a sense of agency and not get so stuck with the unbearable. So yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Can you say, I know fight and flight, but can you go through the flop and the other things? Because I was really curious about that.
Yeah, sure. Sorry I rushed through it. I know I've spoken about that at Watershed previously, so I didn't particularly want to, I didn't know how much my audience has crossed over, but that is on I think it's on the PM Studio YouTube. I'll put it on my Twitter later if that's useful. So, because I do go through it fully in that talk. So yes, there is fight, flight, but there also is freeze. So when we kind of freeze and just shut down, and flop, which is kind of complex. But I think it's complex. But flop is where we kind of are just become disengaged, become something of an automaton. So you're awake and you're there, but you don't really kind of have agency of what you're doing, and you just kind of do it, and you're not really there. And then we have friend, which is also sometimes called fawn, which might be where you try and make friends with the person who could harm you to protect yourself, or you might try and make friends with somebody who can protect you from harm. And this is based on Babette Rothschild's work in The Body Remembers, which is body psychotherapy work. So I hope that says a little bit more about that, but it's a big topic and there's so much to it. And I was like, hold on a second, I know fight and flight and freeze, what are all the rest? So it was really interesting. And yeah, it's I think it's a really important part of the work, and to think how we recognise that might be showing up. Part of my clustered research is how that might show up in news engagement.
Any other questions? No? I've got another question for you, Grace. That way, you can't actually see me that way. What are the next steps for your research? Where's it going next?
Great question, thank you. So yeah, it's really exciting. So at the moment, I'm just about to start recruiting for user testing research. So if anybody's interested in being part of that, please sign up on my website, gracequantock.com, for postcards to the margins where I update about my work and give out tools and techniques about managing trauma and how we live in a world like this and be as well as we can and make change. So I'm currently going to use testing. We're going to be testing the wireframe. It's really exciting. And then thinking more widely how we can actually roll this out to help start both the protocols and the actual prototype be a part of making a shift in the news. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah? I really, really would like to thank you, Grace. That was really interesting and it really resonates. And I will take your words whenever I look later with my doom scrolling. Thank you very much. Also to the BSL interpreters. And I think I'm expecting something on the screen, am I right? QR code? No, we're not doing that bit. Great. I'm not going to talk about a QR code. So before you go, next week's talk is by studio residents Alison Neighbour and Taryn. Alison and Taryn will talk about their approach to using game mechanics to entice new audiences and the risks and joys of a very ambitious experiment in audience engagement. And finally, next Friday is another busy one. There's Open Studio Friday and a Lunchtime Talk, of course, and we're also hosting First Friday, which is a monthly social event from 5 until 6. And if you're joining us in person, then we're very excited that studio residents Alison Neighbour and Roxana Vilk will be there to show you some things they're working on. That's very informal chats with interesting things to look at and try rather than formal presentations. And you can book free tickets via the Watershed website. If you want to stick around today and Hot Desk, you're very welcome to. You can come and chat to us as well. Find one of our studio team. Raise your hand if you're studio team. There they are. Yeah, and if you're watching online, drop us a line on studio@watershed.co.uk. And a massive thank you again to Grace and you all for coming. Thank you.